Okay, a lunchtime webinar starting shortly after noon. This is great. Um, so good afternoon, everyone. Again, thank you so much for making space in your week to join our webinar on turning the tide on BC's coastal habitat loss. My name is Kate McMillan. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Ocean Conservation Manager for CPAWS-BC, and I will be your facilitator for this afternoon's panel. I would like to first acknowledge my colleague, Alicia Elgart, who has been putting in a lot of time to plan this panel, but unfortunately, as things happen, she is sick today. So thank you everyone for bearing with me as I step into this role and help guide today's conversation. I would like to acknowledge that I am joining all of you today from the unceded traditional and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, who have been the stewards of these lands and waters encompassing so-called Vancouver since time immemorial. And today we wanted to bring together everyone to talk about the coastal habitats and the important role that they do play in supporting biodiversity, as well as mitigating impacts of climate change. So throughout this next hour, we will get to know these ecosystems, how they're being impacted by coastal development, and what we can be doing to help support their revitalization. And in this conversation, we're going to be investigating throughout it how the forthcoming BC coastal and marine strategy can help address these issues as we continue to advocate for a healthy marine ecosystems along the entire coast. So just a friendly reminder, this webinar is being recorded. If you do have any questions, you are welcome to put them in the Q&A box, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. And we will try to answer as many as we can with the 60 minutes we have today. So I would like to first just give a quick introduction to our panelists and everyone. Before any questions, if you want to add anything else, you are more than welcome to do so. So joining us today, we have Jacqueline Bars, who's the Ecosystems Restoration Specialist with WWF Canada. We have Kyla Sheehan, who's the Project Manager for the Pacific Salmon Foundation. Also joining us is Councillor Michael Wolf from the City of Vancouver. And we also have Parliamentary Secretary Kelly Green, who is the Parliamentary Secretary for Fisheries and Aquaculture in the Ministry of Waters, Lands, and Resource Stewardship.
Just to clarify, it's the City of Richmond I'm a councillor with, not Vancouver.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Well, losing too many things on my screen. And yes, I think we have potentially a couple other staff from Walrus, the Ministry of Waters, Lands, and Resource Stewardship. So at any point, if they want to jump in, Kelly, I can get them, give them access to join the panelist side. So yes, just as we start talking about coastal habitats and how we are connected to this space in this conversation, we really, are kind of coming from a place right now that the Ministry of Waters and Land and Resource Stewardship have been working with coastal First Nations to co-develop this first ever coastal marine strategy for BC. And this really will be serving as a comprehensive plan that will both better protect and manage the coast and the activities up and down it. And at this time, we do expect that the strategy should be rolled out in early 2024. So I have a first quick question for Parliamentary Secretary Green. On this timeline, is this still what we should be expecting for the release of our first ever coastal marine strategy?
Yes, we're working hard at finalizing the last bit. I think that folks had a chance to see the What We Heard report, which I thought was, wonderful. What We Heard report, so great. But it's being co-developed with Coastal First Nations as well. That work is really important for reconciliation. And we're on track for next year.
Awesome, that's great to hear. And yeah, for folks who haven't seen the What We Heard report, Deborah just dropped it into the chat there. And it did summarize nearly 1,000 individuals' feedback on the intentions paper that came out earlier this year. And when we were looking through the feedback, it was really prominent that a productive and healthy coast ranked as one of the public's top priorities, and there was a lot of mention about the desire for kelp and eelgrass beds to be restored and protected. So I'd love to ask this question to Kyla and invite you in to, could you tell us a little bit more and provide that brief introduction to what is a coastal habitat? How do we define them, and why are they really significant to marine ecosystems, both for, I guess, marine life and people?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Kate. And I have a really nice illustration to share with this as well, if you don't mind sharing. So coastal habitats are really vital to our way of life. They're a part of our economy, our cultures, recreation, and of course, as we know, they provide critical habitat for the species of our coastal food web, which include forage fish and Pacific salmon. And the coastal food web on the Salish Sea is complex and it's very delicate as well. So at the base, we have planktonic organisms that are sensitive to changes in water temperature and chemistry. And we also have schooling fish or forage fish like Pacific sand lance, herring, and surf smelt that are a really important food source for salmon, seals, and orca. I'm just going to see if it comes up here.
Yeah, sorry. You know,
No
we're
worries.
going to do a practice, and I will just I'll catch up with you, Kyla.
No worries. I can also jump in if it's helpful.
Yeah, maybe if you have it ready at
For
the
sure. No worries. Here we go. Yeah, so here we just have a really nice illustration of what our coastal food webs look like on our coasts. So as I was mentioning, we have schooling fish, which are forage fish like Pacific sand lance, herring, and surf smelt. You've got your planktonic organisms. We have our Pacific salmon, our orcas, our riparian vegetation, and of course, we're a part of that coastal food web as well. And we have an undeniable influence on these habitats. So we have a real duty to steward the coast to support the creatures that rely upon these habitats. And in terms of what these coastal habitats can look like, they're really varied. So there are sandy and rocky shores, there are mudflats, coastal bluffs, lagoons, salt marshes, and also nearshore marine waters. And our nearshore waters often have kelp and eelgrass, which you can also see in this imagery here. And those plant systems, they store carbon, and they also provide food and refuge for many other species. So coastal, nearshore, and salt marshes are also very rich habitats that provide refuge for juvenile salmon as they transition from freshwater to saltwater. And they grow bigger and stronger in preparation for their open ocean migration. And then we have sand and gravel beaches that provide spawning habitat for forage fish like surf smelt and Pacific sand lance. And then that riparian habitat that I mentioned up here with beautiful arbutus trees, native shrubs. It provides critical nesting habitat to many bird species like the great blue heron. And it also provides shade and nutrients to our beaches and our nearshore waters. And of course, the waters themselves are migration corridors for resident and transient orca whales. And yeah, as I mentioned, we are a critical part of this food web.
Thank you so much, Kyla. And you know, one of the issues when often when people are learning about coastal habitats and the role that they play, is also talking about the disappearance of them up and down the coast. So we'll just drop actually a link in the chat for folks on a news story about how in the mouth of the Fraser River, we've lost nearly 240 acres of tidal marsh since the 1980s. And one of the reasons for this is through this process called coastal squeeze. So Jacqueline, would you be able to help us understand what coastal squeeze is and how it serves to, or how it results in the loss of coastal habitat? And I will share a slide for you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Kate. So Kyla did an excellent job of explaining kind of like what nearshore habitats are. And so this kind of infographic here, you know, really kind of is to speak to how natural climates exist on our coastline. So on the top panel, what you'll end up seeing is nearshore habitats, and the ones that I'm going to focus on are the salt marsh and the eelgrass beds. So eelgrass is a flowering aquatic grass. It's tend to be found in the shallow subtidal areas, and as Kyla says, it provides a lot of habitat for different fish species. It also supports a lot of bivalves, clams, things that a lot of the First Nations rely on. And then, of course, we have like the salt marsh. And in natural systems, they will experience kind of natural tidal fluctuation. They require various access to light to be able to grow. And so we'll just have this kind of natural system. But what we're beginning to see with response to climate change is sea levels are beginning to rise. And as sea levels rise, they begin to kind of result in these systems being moved out of their kind of most ideal growing conditions. So of course, for eelgrass beds, they kind of grow to the most ideal conditions of light that they can access in the photic zone of the shallow subtidal area. So as sea level rises, it begins to get deeper for them. And so they're going to have to kind of migrate towards the shore and that back shore section. And for salt marsh, it's the same thing. They are vegetation that are salt tolerant, but they only experience periodic flooding from the tidal fluctuations moving in. And so to prevent permanent waterlogging, they are also going to move landward in their migration to kind of maintain those ideal conditions. And so what can happen though is in areas where we start to have coastal development or we see seawalls and different alterations of our shoreline, these systems, which you'll see in the bottom panel, are going to be unable to begin to migrate landward. They're going to kind of be squeezed for that space that they exist. And that's actually going to reduce the size of that habitat. So coastal squeeze is ultimately kind of the loss of coastal habitat or habitat degradation due to coastal development or man-made structures that are going to prevent that landward migration of the habitats in response to the sea level rise. And thus, this continuation of coastal development around British Columbia will kind of contribute to further loss of nearshore habitats as sea level rise increases and this kind of response to climate change.
Thank you, Jacqueline, for that great explanation. And we know that, when we're thinking about shorelines and coastal habitats, but they are used by more than just the marine life, that we might be using these places as their homes and finding food and whatnot, but also that people are using these areas too for recreation, for economic purposes, for housing purposes too, as well as maybe cultural and spiritual activities. And for several years, the traditional methods of protecting communities from the wave action and coastal erosion has been to build these structures that you were referring to of seawalls and dikes and jetties. And so, Kyla, would you be able to just share more specifically, why this method isn't the most effective for either protecting biodiversity that depends on this nearshore habitat? And what are some alternatives that we can be using in the future?
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to get a bit wordy with the impacts of hard armoring because there's a lot of different impacts, so I want to cover them adequately. But yeah, you're right. So historically, we've gone with these methods of seawalls, dikes, and jetties to manipulate coastal processes and hold water back from land so that we can use it for agriculture, housing, and industry. And it's really pervasive. So I'm just going to share my screen here with some images. So hopefully that's loaded now. So this is a preliminary map from the Resilient Coast for Salmon project that I lead at PSF. And what you're seeing in orange here is where there are coastal modification structures like seawalls, riprap, marinas, and others. And this is for the community of Oak Bay. So you can see that it's really extensive. And so one of the issues with imposing these structures is that we're trying to control natural processes so that conditions remain the same, but that's not really how shorelines naturally function. So coastal processes make our shores naturally dynamic, where erosion and deposition are occurring simultaneously. And with climate change, those forces that cause our shores to change will become more intense. So with sea level rise and increased frequency and intensity of storms, this will mean more incoming wave action and erosion. And sediments naturally shift around on the coast, being transported from one area to another, as you're seeing in this illustration. There's a sediment sink up at the top here, moved over by longshore current. But when we impose structures like seawalls, those processes get altered, which could mean that sediment sources are cut off. So some of these coastal bluffs might be cut off from being able to contribute to our coastal processes. And this means that the sediment sink down here is going to starve. The beach will be starved of sediment. Another example of this is unintended impacts on adjacent areas of shoreline. So we often see this when one property owner has a seawall, and this ends up exacerbating erosion on the neighboring property, which ends up forcing that neighbor to put up a seawall themselves just to keep up with the erosion. And as Jacqueline said, in that beautiful explanation of coastal squeeze, we're seeing that imposing seawalls and other structures means that there's a loss of terrestrial and marine connectivity. So yes, that habitat is not able to migrate, and also you're losing that connection between the upland and the marine, and it should be very fluid. There should be a lot of exchange of nutrients and processes there. So without a riparian buffer of native trees and shrubs, there's also runoff that can enter the marine environment without being filtered through the soil and the roots of those plants. So another core issue that I want to talk about that happens when shorelines are armored is about the interaction of the sea and the structure. So on a natural shoreline, like you see in the right-hand side of this image, waves have a chance to slow down and settle out on the beach on a kind of a natural angle. But when there's a fixed structure, like you see on the left-hand side, the incoming wave is stopped in its tracks by that seawall, and the energy is directed vertically. So this causes scour at the base of the structure. You see by that arrow there. And that scour can change the sediment composition of the beaches, which could potentially impact species like forage fish who spawn in that sand. The scour at the base and the pressure of those incoming waves can also compromise the structural integrity of the seawall, which could cause it to crack or fail over time. And as I said, with climate change, we're just going to see more of that happening. And when the wave's energy strikes the wall, it's also directed vertically as well as downwards. So again, it's putting that pressure on the structure, and then it's also flinging the water towards the house that the wall is meant to protect. And that's called overtopping, which you can see in that big wave splash there. And modified structures can also directly impact our coastal food web as well. So seawalls have been shown through research to reduce the availability and the diversity of epibenthic invertebrates, which are a really important food source for salmon. So when salmon are next to a seawall or other artificial structures, they end up feeding on alternative types of prey that are harder to catch and less nutritious. And then we have structures like piers and docks, which are also known as overwater structures, and these can influence salmon survival. So salmon end up avoiding these areas because the lack of light underneath them makes the environment too dark for them to be able to see predators, to find prey, to orient themselves, or to school together. So instead, the salmon are swimming into deeper water to get around the structures, which expends more energy and could also expose them to more predators. And also, as you might expect, the dark environments underneath those structures don't allow algae, kelp, or eelgrass to grow. And that means that the planktonic creatures that normally feed on those plants are also absent. And those are a really good source for juvenile salmon. So there's a lot of connections here. One thing might be thrown out of whack, but that obviously impacts the entire coastal food web. So all of this is not very good, and I want to get to the solution. So we can use nature-based solutions to restore and protect where it's appropriate. And nature-based approaches just mean that we are working with nature rather than against it. So instead of all those structures that I was talking about, like seawalls and jetties, we are not trying to change the processes that are naturally occurring. We're allowing them to happen, and these nature-based approaches are inspired by those natural processes, and they're supported by the processes. So here we have a home where a seawall has been removed and the invasive plants like blackberry have been removed behind it. And then the backshore has been converted to a sloped beach with large woody debris, dune grass, and other native plants. So the exact technique of a nature-based solution that we choose is very site dependent. But some common techniques could be building rain gardens and bioswales to capture and filter runoff naturally before it enters waterways. You could add sediment to a beach where there has been erosion. That's called beach nourishment. You can install natural woody structures to catch and hold sediment on the beach and provide habitat. You could plant native shrubs, grasses, and trees to build a riparian buffer, or even directly on the shoreline, providing habitat there. And you can also provide hybrid approaches where the risk of erosion is really high. So that could be a combination of gray infrastructure like a rock revetment and a gabion basket in combination with a nature-based technique that helps to enhance the habitat. Thanks.
Thank you, Kyla. I feel like that was definitely a big crash course. We'll drop this just as you're talking about that. I know these conversations around changing what our shorelines look like also do have a high cost to them as well. And there's an interesting report that came out last year that looked specifically at Stanley Park, but had these interesting proposals of what a different type of shoreline for that area would look like rather than the hard shore seawall that we're all familiar with. So thank you, Deborah, for dropping that in. Just with that question, and it had to do a lot with planning and the future and you know, a lot of coordination for the coast to change what our coastlines would look like to help ensure their sustainability for the future. I just want to shift our attention back to the BC Coastal Marine Strategy, because in the What We Heard report, there was a lot of respondents that were really keen to both prevent and reverse the harmful impacts of the ongoing and the current and historical modifications that we've seen along our shorelines. And this might be through some setback requirements or restrictions of the use of certain types of materials, in addition to those suggestions of just even changing what a shoreline looks like from hard to soft. So I wanted to ask you, Parliamentary Secretary Green, you know, how do you expect that the province will address these issues with the Coastal Marine Strategy? And could you give us any idea of the approaches that could be taken with the strategy or are currently being taken right now?
Thanks very much. I've also got Charlie should be on the line too in case we need to get a little bit deeper into this. We're looking at a couple things right now. We're looking at the Coastal Marine Strategy, looking at those the nearshore habitats and figuring out how we can protect them, how we can enhance them, restore them, to make sure that we're fighting climate change in with a more holistic lens. There's also a parallel to this, a BC flood strategy that's being developed right now, which would include nature-based solutions as part of that. And you know, to the point earlier is that it's very site specific. So looking at different risks and conditions in different areas and tailoring response to that, as well as having to work very often with local governments in delivering infrastructure that protects people's livelihoods and homes often, which is obviously very important. I know that the city of Richmond has been very mindful of the risks that the city has as a city that's very low lying. So partnerships are definitely very important on delivering that. And I'm going to ask Charlie if he's got anything that he would like to add with respect to the CMS and and flood protection.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for letting me join in there. I was trying to respond to Kate and I couldn't, everything was locked down. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Charlie Short. I'm an exec director with the Ministry of Water, Land and Resource Stewardship, and work with my team here on co-developing the coastal marine strategy with Parliamentary Secretary Green's office and the Minister's office. And so I would say that, like, we did get, like was said earlier, a resounding kind of response to the intentions paper, and a lot of that was around coastal restoration, coastal protections, and what kind of things we can do to improve climate change resiliency in coastal communities, but also in our more naturally based systems. So there is dedicated sections in the draft strategy that focuses attention on that. And then, as Parliamentary Secretary Green was saying, that we need to be mindful of, like, this is a pretty diverse coastline, so different tactics and approaches and actions may be more or less relevant depending on where you are. So it's not getting into the hyper specifics on how to do that, but broadly speaking, that we want to pivot and transition and focus energy around nature-based solutions where they're needed. Look at different types of approaches to shoreline armoring where that's feasible and necessary. And so I think it's pretty exciting, because these are the things that people have been talking about for a long time, and we know from experience elsewhere that it's the right way to go. And so the strategy is sort of trying to paint that vision and provide that long-term objective of doing that.
Thank you both. And also, yeah, sorry everyone. I thought that we had our chat working and it's not. And I think since we're in the Zoom now, can't make that change. So human error, apologies, but you can put lots of messages in the question and answer. And Deborah and Carlo, I know, are using that right now as a way. So thank you everyone for that. We are many years into using Zoom, and it's still fun to find hiccups here and there. But Charlie, just something you were saying there, especially around climate resilience, really reminds me of something we often hear talked about is blue carbon and the use of coastal habitats as a place to sequester carbon from the air, and how they kind of, is a nature-based solution for fighting climate change. And in the What We Heard report, there was, as we said before, the highlighting of the importance of specifically protecting kelp and eelgrass around the blue carbon sinks that they provide, as well as the critical coastal habitat. So just want to jump to Jacqueline. Could you just quickly run us through some of the ways that coastal ecosystems are able to really supercharge our efforts to mitigate climate change, and specifically around salt marshes and eelgrass? And afterwards, Charlie, if you wanted to jump in on anything again for coastal strategy, happy to have that.
Thanks, Kate. So I think probably what's best is to kind of define what blue carbon is, because it is kind of a buzzword, but it's a lot of things that people don't quite understand. So blue carbon is kind of the carbon that's stored in the ocean, including carbon dioxide that's dissolved in the ocean water. It's carbon that becomes stored in underwater sediments and within the marine organisms themselves. And so the key area to focus on is kind of the coastal blue carbon ecosystems. So this is the carbon that is absorbed and kind of stored in plants, algae, and sediments of the coastal ecosystems, predominantly things like salt marsh and eelgrass meadows. Kelp is a very unique one. It's a very early stage focused area, because we know that the plant itself does a lot of this, but it doesn't have as much of that sediment storing capacity. And we know that these coastal blue carbon habitats, kind of to really reiterate what Kyla says, they do provide many benefits for people, nature, and the climate. So they support biodiversity. They include a lot of nursery habitat for ecologically, economically, and culturally important fish species. So they're supporting indigenous, local, and commercial fisheries, and kind of the various traditional harvests that are associated with that. They're also known to improve water quality and clarity. So eelgrass beds and salt marshes are are trapping sediments that are coming out of terrestrial interfaces, and that kind of increases the water clarity in the area. The vegetation itself can actually absorb some of the pollutants that are being experienced and reducing bioaccumulation threats that kind of can exist within the marine ecosystems and the coastal food webs. They provide protection from flooding and coastal erosion, land loss, because the vegetation themselves are known to dampen like wave energy, to reduce coastal flooding that can occur, and they're minimizing that destructive force being experienced on the shoreline. So they're very vital in that. But of course, that big climate resilient piece is the fact that they sequester and store carbon, reducing the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere, really helping to mitigate climate change. And so the really big way that they're doing that is, they are removing carbon dioxide via photosynthesis. So how the plants themselves are growing. They will collect some of more of the carbon material that comes from the freshwater system and bury it into their sediment. So it's very important there. And they lock up that carbon in sediment through their extensive root system. So they're really, really vital in that way. And another really unique benefit that's sort of beginning to happen is we know that, there's a lot of carbon dioxide being released into our atmosphere, and about a third of it is being absorbed by our ocean. And the negative pieces that are coming through this absorption that's happening is our oceans are becoming much more acidic, which is going to start impeding the shell formation of marine species such as clam, oysters, and crabs. So things that we really rely on economically in BC, but also for the First Nations who rely on bivalves and things for traditional harvest. So, these are important building blocks. And what's being realized is that eelgrass beds can provide these climate refuge for marine life, like the shellfish and crabs. They buffer the impacts of ocean acidification. So they're, taking up that photosynthesis piece. And so it's very important for us to kind of retain, intact coastal ecosystems as a form of, climate change mitigation, because degradation and loss of these ecosystems decreases that capacity to store carbon. It decreases the capacity for us to have, this economic reliability on the ocean, and also, decreases our capability of utilizing this to buffer climate change and provide the beneficial services to British Columbia.
I'll take a pause in case any of our panelists want to jump in before I move on to another question I have.
Yeah, I was hoping Charlie would be able to share some of the actions in the coastal marine strategy with respect to carbon sequestration and the benefits for both climate and biodiversity and economic value, as well as what was noted, the social impact on communities.
Thanks, Kelly, and thanks, Jacqueline. Like so when we went through this in the intentions paper, there was a lot of, well, starting with the co-development process, there was a lot of interest in like beefing up, our efforts on monitoring those particular coastal habitats, eelgrass meadows, kelp, rocky reef ecosystems, because we have a sort of a patchwork of initiatives going on. We actually don't like fully understand what we even have right now, and therefore can't really understand how much we are gaining or losing. And then it makes it really difficult to do those, like, what are we sequestering, calculations, what are we storing, etc. So that's became a pretty top priority as we went through the co-development process, as well as the heard from public engagement and through the What We Heard report. So there's a bunch of focus on that, like making sure we have a pretty robust, stable monitoring program that's done in partnership with communities and Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. And then that also trickles down into like creating jobs and training and sustaining that kind of like monitoring and restoration economy. And so that's all kind of in there now as some specific actions to pursue over the long term, because we do know in the Pacific Northwest we are losing kelp with water temperature rising. but more and less in certain areas, right? And so we know our neighbors to the south of us have recently enabled some legislation around monitoring for their state departments to make sure that they're doing that every year. And so we're looking at just building those more stable partnerships so we can continue to do that, so we can understand exactly, Jacqueline, what you were talking about a little bit better and make more informed decisions. In particular here, because we also we do have wild harvest for kelp, and we do unintentionally impact, sensitive ecosystems like eelgrass. So we want to be able to ensure we mitigate that as much as possible and do that in the right way. So that I would just say like that's kind of in there now, and that's kind of exciting because it's a little bit more broader than a lot of the sort of more focused site-specific projects we have going on, so we can expand that reach a little bit. Well, that's the intention, at least.
Thank you. Michael, we have been talking a lot about the impacts on and the opportunities also when it comes to coastal strategy on protecting shorelines and communities. And, we are aware that local governments, especially those who have communities that touch the coastline and up and down the coast, we're really at the forefront of calling for the BC Coastal Strategy. To acknowledge that in 2020, the Richmond City Council did pass a motion calling on the province to adopt a coastal marine strategy and law to help stop coastal habitat loss. And also that year at UBCM, which is the Union of BC Municipalities, so many acronyms that we are always using, also had the resolution calling on the provincial government to adopt a coastal strategy. So from your experience with your community, what really are local governments needing from the provincial government to help solve these issues that are impacting your community and the people who live there?
Great, thanks. Yeah, my training early on was in conservation biology, and I really appreciated the images that Kyla and Jacqueline presented there, because they're basically what I see being the surrounding of Richmond. For those who don't know, Richmond's made up of 20 some odd islands. Lulu Island is the big one where the 200,000 residents are, and Sea Island is where the YVR airport is. So we're completely tidally influenced. The tide comes in and all the way to the eastern tip where New Westminster is. So it's a very unique situation. It's not just a river on both sides of us and an ocean on the west. So we're smack dab in the middle of the Fraser River estuary. We rely on our diking system, which is that riprap rock style that cascades down towards the low tide mark. We don't have those large retaining walls like you saw in the seawall image there. And so we probably would rely on a provincial diking authority, but in the absence of that, we have to do it ourselves. So we have to purchase land, we have to create super dikes, we have to disrupt what is already on those dikes, which is roadways or recreational routes. And because it's basically on us to do it, and other municipalities like to the south, they don't. They're kind of waiting for the province or the feds to fund it and do it for them. Whereas we're taking the value of the assets in this city and they have a strategy that goes to, I think the last date I saw was 2071 or something like that, where we have plans to build out all the parts of the dike and do it well and not wait. Unfortunately, we don't have a provincial diking authority to do that. Another big ask would be to get the Fraser River Estuary Management Plan back. It's referred to as FREMP. And it was in place for about 30 years. And then during the Harper government, they took it away or killed it. And now it's left to the Port of Vancouver to figure out what's of value and what should be retained and habitat compensation and all that stuff, which basically means it doesn't get done. So we need that to be reinstated, and the province could take a lead role in doing that. We have identified in a UBC study a couple of years ago by Dr. Tara Martin, the 102 species that are at risk of extinction in the Fraser River estuary. There's no overarching plan for them. Yes, we just recently got some words from the provincial government to get some protection for endangered species. In October, they said there's going to be a fund to protect areas and biodiversity. In November, they've released the biodiversity and ecosystem health framework, but there's no interim measures. Today, there was their last sitting of the fall session. Nothing short-term, no laws, no commitment from when they promised when they got elected in 2017 that there was going to be strong laws to protect endangered species. Still not anywhere close to that, it seems. We have so much work that can be done that is being left. There's multi-jurisdictional issues. When you talk about doing work at the nearshore habitat, it all overlaps with municipal, federal, and provincial. So for us to get work done, to build things, to put in piers, to demolish structures, it's tied up in this such a complex regulatory process. It's a long permitting process. We need to be able to speed up some of those things when it's beneficial for biodiversity in the area. We need more funding for ecological projects. Probably things like the herring and fish that was mentioned earlier. They're still being fished out. We're going to see in our lifetime the end of herring mass spawning events if we keep letting the last of those get fished right out. So we need to help transition those fishers off that lifelong thing that they've been doing. We have the largest small craft harbor in Canada in Steveston, over 500 commercial fishing boats, and there's not even a pump out station. So that means the vessels that have sewage on board, if they can't get 3 nautical miles away, they just let it go right there, right in the middle of the south arm of the Fraser. We need funding, and again, that multi-jurisdictional solution to things like that. I could go on, but maybe you probably want to ask something else.
No, thank you so much for that. And even just talking about the dumping of sewage, you know, we last month had, or maybe it was September, whatever September was, I think that's a couple months ago now, had a similar webinar, but talking specifically about different types of marine pollution and the opportunities and solutions that a coastal strategy could also provide. And, you know, it's such a vast topic, but the impacts are so wide ranging on, you know, large species like orcas, all to, you know, the small clams on the shoreline, but they're important for harvesting, especially for Indigenous communities that have depended on these foods and used them since time immemorial. So yeah, there's the intersectionality of a lot of these issues that are happening along our coast and our ocean. It is really, you know, I feel really hopeful when we have these conversations around a coastal strategy of finding solutions to these issues that are really long-standing, and how can we actually start working together to resolve them. And Michael, one of your questions there about, you know, or acknowledgement of the jurisdiction of the coastline being complicated is actually one of the first questions that someone from our audience attendees had posed. So I would love to actually put this to the panelists right now. Whoever wants to jump in, I think it might be more directed to yourself, Kelly or Charlie, but, you know, looking at the complications of the shoreline, and this is from Douglas Swanston, how will multiple governing agencies, such as the federal government, First Nations, as well as provincial and municipal governments, work cooperatively given that sea level rise and the changing high water mark? This is especially important around municipal boundaries and land developments impacting the near shore.
Thanks so much, and thank you to Councillor Wolf for his thoughts there. It was nice to be on council with him and work together on a number of climate initiatives. And I think it is important to realize that you know, the coastal marine strategy is BC. We've done the consultation to bring BC's voice on what our vision and values are for our coastal environment, what our priorities are for the health and well-being of our communities, how that ties in with the economic well-being as well, and overarching value of reconciliation. It is a strategic document, and it also is, I really want to emphasize what our vision is for for the coastal marine environment, but we don't necessarily have the legislative tools to be able to enact it. So part of the benefit of having this is that when we're going to the federal government and we're saying, these are the directions we really want to move, we need you to take action. We've got, you know, a good strategy on how we're going to get there. And so there is definitely that interaction, and with a key priority on making sure we're having good government to government relations with First Nations in all areas of the coast. And I think probably I'm going to ask Charlie to jump in with respect to nearshore complications with the rising sea level.
Sure thing. And so I think one of the there is a section in the draft now, which is it's still being developed, right? So people haven't seen this all yet, and it's I think it was also part of the intentions paper. In fact, it was just around, you know, collaborative governance and engagement. And so we have noted exactly kind of what the person who asked that question has stated. Like, there is a complicated relationship between the province, the federal government, First Nations governments, and local governments as it relates to roles and responsibilities and who does what and who, you know, takes the lead versus participate, all that kind of stuff. And so that's flagged as a bit of a gap, right, in terms of how we work together. So there's been some calls to action around a more regular interaction between all levels of government on key priorities where you have that multi-jurisdictional like roles and responsibilities. Now we do that sometimes, and it's usually done like on an initiative by initiative or issue by issue basis, but we don't have a regular sort of forum for that. And that came out when we met with a variety of stakeholders and local governments back in March in Vancouver with a policy forum. But we need to do these more often. So there's some calls to action in the strategy around that where we can get to, you know, while building those relationships that are necessary to make change and progress. So that's one thing. And then with regards to like the changing high water mark, I mean, that's pretty interesting. I know that like I don't know the answer to that question, to be honest. Like that is something that's going to be fairly dynamic. What I do know from our climate change folks and modelers that we are modeling, you know, the shoreline, you know, changes over time with climate change models and sea level rise models. Now, how that factors in to local government zoning and setbacks and private land and stuff, I'm not sure yet, but I do think that is a conversation that people are really keen to have. And then how do we build the appropriate buffer so we're not tripping over each other with that? But that's, I think, work to come for sure, based on our confidence in our models as we see them now.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Charlie. Jacqueline, I see your hand is up. We can go to you next, and Michael.
Yeah, I think kind of what Charlie was just speaking to right there around like the modeling and knowing like how shorelines are changing and how does that play into zoning things. And I think it's one of those pieces that can be a really unique tool is looking kind of at like that Shoreline Protection Act. The fact that, you know, it is a lot of private homeowners who are putting up seawalls and things like this within different pieces. And then because, you know, I think there's a lack of a tool that can be utilized by, you know, the municipal governments, that they're kind of at a loss of how they interact and operate around there. They have a lot more guidance that has been provided by the province around the riparian areas regulations, so how they operate in around like the streams and those types of systems, but they have less guidance for the shoreline. And I think something like, you know, a Shoreline Protection Act, where you actually really do think about the setbacks, you really think about the riparian vegetation that Kyla was really talking about. By putting in this type of mechanism, you're going to start achieving a lot of those other outcomes that you were looking at, like the protect and restore nearshore habitats and blue carbon habitats, and maintaining that really important, you know, coastal nearshore food web that exists, because of course you have these plants that are providing the vegetation, but when, you know, local government don't have anything to guidance on, and somebody's like, oh, I'm going to put this seawall up because it's going to protect my house from coastal erosion, you know, you're starting to like just see these negative effects build up in that downstream piece that Kyla was kind of pointing out in her bit. So I think something like really looking at those legislative mechanisms that are going to be really good tools that, you know, municipal governments can use coastally around British Columbia and even First Nations to really enhance and protect those nearshore environments that face that threat of coastal squeeze and that loss of those coastal habitats.
Totally echo that, Jacqueline. That's exactly what's been missing, that legislative framework for collaboration. I've been on council for 5 years. And what I've seen is that our city's approach is to just do things on our own while we're waiting. So we've mapped out our own ecological network. We're creating our own fish habitat bank. We are actually planning to open up part of the dike to let an intertidal habitat occur inside our boundary in Terra Nova Park, because then it would be under our control, and allow potential spawning for sturgeon or salmon to come into Richmond inside the dike, which is a little bit of a risky thing to do when you don't want water to come in the dike. But then you gain foreshore habitat, right? How else can we gain habitat other than build it out past our dike? But in that case, then you're in the jurisdictional mess. Another thing we did was we purchased the last and largest privately owned land on the Sturgeon Bank. Sturgeon Bank is the huge landmass to the west of our West Dike. It was known as the Grower Lands, and we just purchased it and work with Ducks Unlimited to do that. As was mentioned earlier about it wasn't mentioned, but jetties is another way that we've disrupted the flow of sediment. And we're now working with the Rain Coast Conservation Foundation to puncture holes in these jetties to allow fish to cross, so they don't have to get thrown out to the end of the jetty and then get eaten and not find their way back to the good habitat of eelgrass beds on the other side. So that's a great strategy. Unfortunately, the Delta Port expansion's coming through, and the first thing that project should be doing is creating a breach in that road that goes out to the Delta Port. But no, they're just going to thicken it up and double it up and make it even worse. We need to work with other groups. I think Ducks Unlimited is a main partner in pumping sediment from one side of the jetty over to the Sturgeon Bank, where we've lost that 85% of the marsh habitat. It's gone into the mud flat. Richmond, the main island, is 49 kilometers around. When I go in my little 9-foot boat and go all the way around Richmond, it takes me about 8 hours. I end up doing about 80 kilometers because you have to go so far out, because that mud flat is just incredible. It's like 10 kilometers out. You got to do this big block around. And many times I've gone aground and had to walk in the mud to pull my boat because I bottom out. But anyway, it's an incredible amount of work that we have to do on our own. The city just hired a habitat compensation staff person, so that as we do our dike work, we can look at what we're losing and how we can restore it and put it back in place. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much for those additional comments and suggestions, both Jacqueline and Michael. I don't know if there's anything else folks want to jump in on this question before. I think we have time for one last question before we got to wrap, and folks probably have other Zoom meetings and things to attend to. Okay, so there's quite a few here, but there's one from Sam Smith. I'll drop this in the chat for the hosts and panelists to also see, but would someone be able to comment on any thoughts that you have about either convincing or incentivizing landowners to redevelop their existing waterfront properties to incorporate more natural shorelines, which can be very costly and can lead to a loss of their land too?
Yeah, I can jump in there. I think that for shoreline restoration, it's important that we support neighboring shoreline property owners to work together, and kind of like a community-led project, because you can do it property by property. But of course, as I mentioned, there's going to be cumulative impacts where one homeowner might have a seawall and that impacts the success of the project next door. And so we really need to be thinking about it on a larger scale. And homeowners often take on the burden of the cost and doing a lot of research into this. So generally, I think just some support in terms of incentive programs in funding that's available for community-led restoration and access to resources. And there are a ton of resources out there, and there's programs like Green Shores where folks can reach out for some guidelines on what to do. But also I would say that in the long term, we need to be thinking about how our coastal communities are planning for sea level rise. So new coastal developments need to be thinking way ahead into the future, and we need to leave a lot of room on the coast for sea level rise and also for habitat, so that we're allowing those habitats to move and adjust with conditions, and we're not putting those communities at risk. So a lot of those homeowners might not be aware of where the sea will be in 50 years down the road, and we don't want to put anyone in danger of a floodplain that could be there, for instance.
Thank you, Kyla. I'm just keeping an eye on time, and so I'm going to move us to wrap up. But I have don't leave yet. I just have a couple of comments just to make sure that folks know what to expect next. So first of all, I just want to say a really sincere thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. I know you are all very busy, and just taking the time to share your knowledge and experience with us this afternoon is so valuable. We've been working with CPAWS, with West Coast Environmental Law, to create these webinars that can help really dig into specific issues that a coastal strategy is trying to address. Because when we look at the coast, there is just so much happening, and the connection between these issues and what provincial jurisdiction versus municipal or federal and Indigenous rights and title of these waters it can be very complicated. And so we really want to help provide this resource to help explain some of these topics. So we will share this recording for folks so you can come back to it if you really want to learn again. We have one previously that will be uploaded to YouTube soon, which will be on that marine pollution. And we're hoping to plan one in the new year that will be a lot around laws and regulations. So I know there's that came up in a couple of questions and comments. So I think that will be hopefully another really helpful webinar for folks. And yeah, I just want to also thank all of our attendees for providing such thoughtful questions. I know that we couldn't get through them all, so we will collect them and we'll pass them off to the panelists that they would be the best to respond and get you those answers. And also just a reminder to everyone, I know we dropped some links, but there might have been some technical issues with copying some of that text to save those links for later. But since you registered for this event, you are going to get an email with all the links and resources that we've shared throughout this last 60 minutes. So it will be coming to you, don't worry. And just one last request is we're gonna, we see that, spring 2024 is hopefully when we'll have the coastal strategy released, but it is really important to keep letting folks in our government know that this is something that we really want. So we do have a postcard that you can sign virtually, and then we're gonna actually print them off and we will hand deliver them to Minister Cullen. And so Kelly Green, I'm sure you will also get to see those postcards on what folks are really wanting to celebrate about a coastal strategy, what you want to see and what the outcome is. So I think that link is shared with everyone, and we'll also circulate it later. So please feel free to do that postcard and we will drop it off. And yeah, I think at that point, I just want to say thank you to everyone, and I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well coordinated.
Thank you.